Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at predestination and the plan of God in our continuing study of the doctrines of the Bible. When we talk about God's will, we can mean one of two things. First of all, we can refer to the commands and the instructions of the Lord, where God says, do this, that's it, that's his will, that you do it. For example, Mark chapter 3, verse 35, Jesus says, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother, and that's talking about the commands of God. God says to do it, and you do it, and then you find out that you're in God's family. Another passage that uses the will of God this way is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3. For this is the will of God. I think we can take that as the command of God, your sanctification. And then he explains that, is why I think it's talking about his commands. That is that you abstain from sexual immorality. So God actually commands that. One of the aspects of sanctification, of holy living, of having yourself set apart to God, is that you be sexually pure. That the sexual practices are to be within the family, and that they not go abroad like that. Secondly, the second thing that we can talk about with regard to God's will are those things which God has planned to come to pass. When we see this term God's will, we can refer to one of these two things, those things that God has commanded people to do. Secondly, those things that God has ordained to take place. And if God has ordained something to take place, let me just say it will take place. So not everything that he has commanded will happen. It is possible to disobey the commands of God. But if he has ordained something to take place, if he has planned for something to take place, it will take place. Let's look at both of these. First of all, when we talk about God's will, notice this is Isaiah chapter 14, beginning in verse 26. This is the plan devised against the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out against all the nations. That's actually parallelisms, two ways of describing the same thing. Verse 27, for the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And that's a rhetorical question. The answer is if God has planned it, it's going to take place. This is speaking of God's will in that ordaining sense. God has ordained certain things to take place. Actually, I think I misspoke. Let me say it more clearly. God has ordained all things that take place, but we haven't proven that yet. We're going to. And then the next line, and as for his outstretched hand, who can turn it back? In other words, no one can. Two rhetorical questions there. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. And we're jumping in the middle of the sentence. It's a very long sentence, but Paul says, also we have obtained an inheritance. Here it is, having been predestined according to his purpose, that is God's purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. Now, what do all things refer? I think they refer to all things. God works all things according to the counsel of his will. He has a plan for history, and he's working it out. And notice, we've been predestined according to the purpose of the one who does that sort of thing. So actually two aspects of God's plan, both that predestined part, and we're going to come back and look at that in a later class. But right now we're looking at the fact that he works all things after the counsel of his will. That's not his commanded will, that's his planned will. That's his eternal will, his will of ordination. Psalm chapter 33, verses 10 and 11. The Lord nullifies the counsel of the nations. And what we have here is a contrast between the counsel of the nations, the plans of the nations. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. But then the other side of that contrast is seen in verse 11. The counsel of the Lord stands forever. The plans of his heart, and notice how you had counsel and plans. The plans of his heart from generation to generation. That is, God's plans are carried out. The counsels of the nations, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And the Lord's able to nullify those. He's able to frustrate the plans of the peoples. I've got a friend who loves to say, man plans and God laughs. And the reason God laughs, the point of that, is that God's plans are bigger than our plans. God's plans are sure. Our plans, not so much. Sometimes they can go right, sometimes they might not. And so notice we have the counsel of the Lord and the plans of his heart go from generation to generation. Acts chapter 17, verse 26. This is Paul's sermon to the unbelievers in Athens. And he says, and he, speaking of God, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. Here it is, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitations. History, the history of nations, the history of people, didn't take place just by happenstance. I mean, it looks that way from our benefit, but that's according to his determination. God decided those things. That's what Paul says in Acts 17:26. Psalm 139, verse 16, that delightful psalm that's talking about the power and presence of God. Notice, your eyes have seen my unformed substance. Well, that's just God's foreknowledge. But notice, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, as when as yet there was not one of them. Notice it speaks of God having ordained, having written. We have a saying sometimes we say, that's written in stone. Well, we're not told, we're told here, in your book these things were written, the days that were ordained for me. That is, when are you going to live? And this is what we're going to see in the next verse. God decides that sort of thing. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, the mind of man plans his way, and we make all sorts of plans, but notice the contrast to that, but the Lord directs his steps. You may make plans. God is the one that carries things out, maybe according to your plans, maybe in spite of your plans. But the Lord directs not his own steps, the Lord directs the steps of man. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. Now, if anyone had free will in anywhere in the world, it was the king. Nobody could tell the king what to do because he was the king. But notice the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He, that is God, turns it wherever he wishes. And so the king might make plans. The king might do what he wants to do. But it's God who directs even the very heart of the king. Not just the actions of the king, but his heart as well. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33. The lot is cast into the lap. When we talk about the lot, that's like flipping a coin or throwing the dice. The lot is cast into the lap. Notice, but its every decision is from the Lord. Now that's speaking of what we think of as chance happenings. And I do believe things happen by chance. The Bible actually uses the word chance. You can grab a concordance and find the word chance in the Bible. But what we find here is that even chance happenings really come from God. So there's a sense in which, can I say it this way? There's a sense in which there really is nothing that happens by chance. God is in control of all of it. It's every decision is from the Lord. And notice it doesn't say the decisions that God wants to be. God lets some things just sort of go their way, and but in other things he takes charge. No, it says it's every decision is from the Lord. What does every refer? I think it refers to every. It's every decision. Every time you flip a coin, every time you cast the lot. By the way, this is maybe a side road, but there's a place over in Acts chapter 1 where the disciples had gathered after the resurrection, after Jesus had ascended into heaven, and they say, we had 12 apostles, but then Judas, he disqualified himself, and he went out and hung himself and died. And so we really ought to have another person to take up that. And they choose, I guess they vote, or they look to see who's qualified. And they come up with 2 qualified candidates. And they go to the Lord and they say, Lord, we're going to cast a lot. By the way, I think they were doing a right thing. I think what they were doing was based here, in part at least, on this proverb. And they cast a lot, and one is chosen and one isn't. And from that point on, he is numbered with the disciples. Now, some people like to say, well, they shouldn't have done that. I think they should have. And the Apostle Paul later on talks about not the 11, but the 12. And so I think he even gives credence to what they did, even though Paul at the time wasn't a believer yet. You say, well, wasn't he an apostle? Yes, but he wasn't one of the 12. And he doesn't describe himself as one of the 12. He describes himself as sort of a different kind of an apostle. But notice the lot is cast into the lap. It's every decision is from the Lord. And they took that principle. Now, I'm not saying we necessarily ought to do that in choosing our church leaders, but they did that here. Every decision is from the Lord, and they did that in Acts chapter 1 at least, with the early church. Here's another passage speaking of the same thing. Job chapter 14, verse 1, we begin with speaking of man who is born of woman, is short-lived and full of turmoil. You go on a few verses down, still speaking of mankind. Since his days are determined, did you catch that? The number of his months is with you, and his limits you have set so that he cannot pass. That's three different lines. Notice they're all saying basically the same thing. His days are determined. What does that mean? Well, it means the number of his months is with the Lord, and God has set how long. How long am I going to live? I don't know, but God does. And not only does God know, but notice it's not just that these things are known; these things are determined. If something's determined, that would suggest it needs a determiner. Just like when we say, for there to be a creation, there needs to be a creator. Well, if there is a determination, there needs to be one who did the determining. And who is that? It is God who does that. And so you have set it so that he cannot pass it. That's not just happenstance. God is the one who has accomplished that. Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. This is right at the end of the book of Genesis. Remember the story that Joseph had been sold into slavery, and then all of these events transpired to do some really wonderful things. And Joseph is speaking to his brothers who had sold him into slavery many years earlier. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me." When they sold him into slavery, they weren't saying, well, we're just, fulfilling God's will. No, they were doing their own thing. But do you see the rest of it? But God meant it for good. God had planned it, used their actions. I would say not only used, but planned their actions. And yet they were doing what they were doing out of their own greed and jealousy. They were operating out of a sinful, sort of a sinful heart. And yet God used that sinful heart, in their case, he meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. And of course, the end of Genesis shows how that many people were preserved alive. In fact, the story goes from, I don't think it just limits itself to the story of Genesis. Because of what happened in Genesis, Exodus takes place, and because of what happens in Exodus, eventually salvation comes to us, and Jesus comes. And so the many people that are preserved alive, I think that includes us. I don't know that Moses, as he was writing this, necessarily had that in mind, but I think it's very true. Acts chapter 4, verses 27 and 28. This is actually by way of a prayer the church is praying to the Lord. And the church says, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant," they're speaking to God, the Father, "your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed," and that's why he's called the Christ, the anointed one. But notice, they were gathered together, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, all these people who conspired together. Now, they weren't all friends with each other. Herod and Pontius Pilate didn't actually like each other. And Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, they didn't like each other. And yet all of these people, notice verse 28, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. Now, we're going to talk in the next class about predestination for salvation, but this isn't predestination for salvation. This is predestination involving the unrighteous attitudes, actions, and decisions of Herod and Pontius Pilate and the unbelieving Gentiles and the unbelieving peoples of Israel to do what God had predetermined, had predestined to take place. Acts chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. This is Peter's sermon to, he says, men of Israel. "Listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know, this man," and notice here's the clincher, "delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge," it's not one or the other, it's both, the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, "you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death." And the next verse says, "Yes, but God made him alive." But notice the point here that their actions, Their actions in the face of miracles and wonders and signs, but their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah, and their delivering him over to be crucified, that was all part of God's predetermined plan, part of his foreknowledge. He knew it was going to happen. And their actions, even the actions of godless men, are included in God's plan, and in this sense, in God's will. Now, that's not his commanded will. God didn't say, you go and crucify Jesus. No, he didn't command that, but it was part of his plan, and in that sense, part of his eternal will. Now, I have to ask the question, we've seen that there are those things that God commanded people to do or not to do. His commands, we can talk about his will. There are those things that God ordained to take place, which will or have taken place, depending on where you're at in the time spectrum. But is there a third type of God's will, one that we talk about those things that God wishes would take place? Let me just say, I don't think so. I think that every use of the term God's plan or God's will can be answered by those first two categories. I don't think there is necessarily those things that God wishes, but that's he's commanding and he's ordaining. But I don't think God has necessarily wish fulfillments that are unsatisfied. Now maybe I'm wrong here, but let's look at a passage that is sometimes taken to refer to that. So that's the question. Let's look and see if we have an answer. 1 Timothy chapter 2, we're going to begin in verse 1. He says, first of all, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions, and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men. Now, who are all men? I think they're all men. And then he gives an example, verse 2, for kings and for who all are in authority. So specifically, he's speaking in context of those people especially. But I don't think it's limited. I think you can pray for all sorts of people. But in this context, especially for those who are in authority, so that, here's the reason why, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Pray for your leaders. I think it's good to pray for your presidents. Pray that, if you want, you can pray for which one gets elected. But whoever gets elected, you should pray for them, that God would work in them and through them. And maybe he'll do that to save them. I've actually prayed for certain presidents that they would know the Lord and come to be saved. I think there have been certain presidents we have that were saved. I think of Jimmy Carter. Now, if you're young, you might not know of him except in history right now. But he's somebody who actually is a believer in Jesus Christ and has publicly confessed his faith. In fact, the last time I heard, he was still occasionally teaching a Sunday school class. I think good for him. And I don't need to pray for his salvation because I think he's already saved. But I think it's good both to pray for the salvation of leaders and presidents. I think it's also good to pray that God would direct their paths, even if they don't know him, even if they continue not to know him, so that, notice that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. But verse 3, this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. Verse 4, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, is that wish fulfillment? Is that God wishing something that would take place? Let me just say, it won't take place. I don't think all men I don't think every single person is going to come to know the Lord. I think we have enough teaching in the Scripture. We're going to see this later on when we get to things like prophecy and eschatology, that all men will not. I'm not a universalist. I think we ought to preach the gospel to all men, but let me just say, not all men are going to believe. And yet, when it says he desires all men to be saved, I don't think that's unsatisfied wish fulfillment. Instead, I would suggest that is his command. It's the same sort of thing that we see in Acts chapter 17, verse 30, where Paul is preaching to the Athenians, to unbelievers, and he says God is now declaring to men that all everywhere, I sort of like that double all, that all people everywhere should repent. That is his command. And I think when he desires all men, he's commanding all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. That when you turn away from Jesus, one of the things you're doing is you're disobeying God's command to come to Jesus, to come and be saved. Now I'd like to talk about several implications of this doctrine. First of all, it means that nothing comes into your life that has not passed through a nail-scarred hand. In other words, it's come through the hands of Jesus, and can I say it this way? Who has blood in the game, literally, who sacrificed himself for you. But I can say that not just about you if you were a believer, but even if you were not a believer. By the way, that also means that you can pray for your non-believing friends if God isn't in charge of all things. We'll see this more in the next class. But anything that happens in your life came from his hands. And sometimes it comes from his hands even though you don't know him yet. And sometimes it comes through his hands even if you never will know him. So that's true in all respects. Secondly, it means that there's no mistakes in the plan of God. If something happens, yes, things happen and they look like they happen just by chance, but really, this was ordained by God. You say, well, that history seems like such a jumble. I think it's a little bit like looking, and maybe you've had this experience of looking at a Persian carpet or even a Middle Eastern carpet. I've not been to Persia, but I have traveled in the Middle East, and I've seen carpets being made by hand. And if you look at the underside of a carpet like that, it's just a mess. It's a hodgepodge of knots and strings, but then you turn it over and look at it from above, and it's a grand and glorious design. Let me just say, I believe that there are no mistakes in the plan of God. But also, I think it means that God really does work all things for good to those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. That's a passage that's at Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And for those that are his people, those things work, even bad things work for good. Remember, that's the lesson that we learned from the voice of Joseph, who said, you meant these things for evil, but God meant them for good. Now, that means that God has determined all things that take place. And all things include, it's not limited to this, but it include salvation. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next class.